Hello guys, welcome back to another Diablo 4 video, and today we're going to be going over my Shadow Rogue build, which utilizes a near infinite loop cycle between Death Trap and Shadow Imbue, as well as both ranged and close quarters damage through permanent rapid fire uptime, which came about after wanting to make a new variation of a Trapper Twisting Blades build, which I was playing up until around level 90, but let's be honest, everyone is playing Twisting Blades, so I wanted to not only make a rapid fire build that worked similar or just as well, but actually offered a bit more than Twisting Blades did, and the amount of synergy working in this build is among the highest of any build I've made in any game so far. So a brief breakdown of the playstyle before we get into how to build it. With rapid fire we have the ability to pick off from range, but like Twisting Blades we can be very aggressive, pop Shadow Imbue, Shadow Step in, pop Death Trap, instantly get our Shadow Imbue back, pop Poison Trap, instantly get our Death Trap back, and repeat the cycle, all whilst having near permanent access to Shadow Step, which is not only our engager but it's also our disengager, our CC break and source of unstoppable, as well as reducing the CD on our subterfuge skills, i.e. Poison Trap, which in turn reduces the CD on our Death Trap, which in turn instantly returns all of our imbuements, which in this case will be Shadow Imbuement. So to put it all together, we'll first go over the talent tree, then the gear needed, then the Paragon board. To start things off, we take the minimum amount of points needed for a generator because we don't use a basic skill in this build, and we move over to our core skill, which will be Rapid Fire, which we fully invest in, moving on to improve the Rapid Fire, which is going to return 15 energy every time it hits a vulnerable enemy, which is going to be all the time, and the reason we do not need a generator. We have 1 point in Shadow Step, moving to Disciplined Shadow Step, and this is important because yes, most builds will run with Methodical Shadow Step for the stun, which is extremely strong, but for reasons I'll elaborate on more later, Shadow Step is a key part of the playstyle in terms of engaging, disengaging, and as mentioned, reducing that Poison Trap CD, as well as the CC break, etc. So we need this skill to be available anytime that we need it, and Disciplined Shadow Step effectively halves its cooldown. We then have 1 point in Dash and move on to Enhanced Dash for the critical damage modifier applied to anything we dash through, and we want to take critical damage and vulnerable damage modifiers anywhere we can because they are our main sources of multiplicative damage. We then want 1 point in Rapid Gambits to reduce the CD on our evade whenever we daze an enemy, which will be all the time for reasons we'll get into later, as well as 1 point in Trick Attacks to knock down a dazed enemy when we critically strike them. We then synergize this with 3 points in Concussive, which grants us 12% critical strike chance against enemies we knock down, which again will be all the time. We then want 3 points in Weapon Mastery for 15% increased critical strike damage when using crossbows, and we do want to be using a crossbow for the native vulnerable damage that comes with them. We then have 1 point in Rugged just so we can access 3 points in Reactive Defense for the 80% reduction when CC'd, and all builds on all classes at endgame will be stacking as much damage reduction as they can, especially for those high tier Nightmare Sigils. Moving down to Subterfuge, we take Poison Trap, Enhanced Poison Trap, which knocks down enemies and synergizes with our Concussive for that critical damage. We then take Countering Poison Trap, which has a 30% chance to reset the CD on our Shadow Imbue, further tying to that infinite loop of accessibility for our damage rotation. I have 3 points in Exploit for that 18% damage to healthy and injured targets, as well as 3 points in Malice for the 9% damage to vulnerable enemies. You see in both instances next to the percentage there is a multiply symbol which suggests these damage modifiers are multiplicative. Now moving on to Shadow Imbuement, I have fully invested 5 points into it for maximum detonation damage, but this will be your wiggle room if you want to drop some points in here for more utility elsewhere, but I find Shadow Imbuement to be really important in situations where that detonation damage can be the difference between a clean pack wipe or you needing to finish the job with a rapid fire. We also take Blended Shadow Imbuement for the further vulnerable stacking. I take 3 points in Precision Imbuement just because of how often Shadow Imbue is active, and it's a 9% critical strike chance on our imbued abilities, and we have a lot of synergy in regard to procs relating to critical strikes, so this is something I would consider an option if again you want to pick up utility elsewhere. I will recommend some utility that you can take instead once we're done here. So now we are of course taking our full path into Death Trap, as well as 3 points into Trap Master for critical strike chance against vulnerable and crowd control targets after activating either Death Trap or Poison Trap. And for our key passive, you have 2 options. Exposure is really what makes that infinite rotation on top of the massive amounts of cooldown reduction and reset we're getting elsewhere. Anytime we damage an enemy in our Poison Trap, most of the time we're massively reducing the CD on Death Trap, though sometimes, depending on the situation, I find that I have enough CD reduction to play around without exposure, which is why another good option in terms of raw damage is Precision. Critical strikes with marksman skills grant a 4% stack with increased critical strike damage stacking up to 20%, where it will then spend those stacks on a guaranteed crit for 40% increased critical damage. And when you consider we're using rapid fire non-stop with a very high crit chance build, this is a massive damage increase, but as mentioned, at the cost of CD reduction on your Death Trap, which also affects your ability to reset your Shadow Imbue consistently, so you might have some downtime on your CDs if you run this. Play around with both and see what you like. In situations that are less mass AoE focused and have a bit more emphasis on single target, I'd recommend precision, but for speed clearing dungeons and sigils, definitely go with exposure. In terms of that optional utility, if you decide to drop points in the previously mentioned skills, if you want more movement speed, you could take 3 points in haste. If you're running with the Penitent Greaves unique boots, you could consider 3 points in frigid finesse for more damage to chill targets, and 1 point in chilling weight to benefit from any damage to slowed enemy rolls on your gear, though in terms of min-maxing you won't have that. You could also take 3 points in debilitating toxins for further damage reduction from enemies affected by your poison trap. For our specialization, we are running with preparation, as we are only running with a core skill, no generator. We're spending 100 energy super fast, reducing the cooldown on death trap, as well as resetting our shadow imbue whenever we pop death trap. In terms of gear, we'll go over the legendary powers or aspects, followed by the ideal stats for each piece. Firstly, we want a crossbow for the native 60% vulnerable damage, and the aspect we must have is rapid fire has a chance to ricochet to another target, which is essential for AoE. For the stats, you can see I only have 3 due to the nature of the weapon and how it was farmed. If you know, you know. But generally in this slot you will want vulnerable damage, critical damage, core skill damage, and if you have close to a max roll of dex, that would also be fine. Now you see I have damage to close enemies. One of the benefits of this rapid fire variant is it actually benefits from both damage to close enemies and distant enemies, and due to its additive nature, if you're forced into taking either, you won't notice much of a disadvantage of having either. The next most important aspect is Manglers, which I have on my gloves, which on lucky hit against vulnerable enemies, it gives us a chance to daze them, which as we've covered in the talent tree, not only knocks them down but procs a 12% critical strike chance against those enemies. For stats on gloves, you have a lot of options, though the most important best in slot stats are going to be a minimum of +3 ranks to rapid fire, critical strike chance, and then you have many options in terms of trap skill cooldown reduction, attack speed, or a close to max roll on lucky hit chance, as lucky hit is very important on any rogue build, but you'll want it to be a high roll to be worth taking in this spot in this limited stat space. You can see I have dexterity, and I would want that to be critical strike chance or a max roll lucky hit chance if I had the choice. Next, for our boots, previously I was running with the Penitent Greaves for the chill effect, but as mentioned earlier, Shadow Step is one of the most important aspects of this build, and with these boots, not only can I place the aspect that gives me 2 charges of Shadow Step, a charge can be refunded if we kill a target with Shadow Step, but I also have the same amount of movement speed as the Penitent Greaves, but with the extra benefit of damage reduction while injured, as well as 4 ranks to Shadow Step, which increases its damage, giving a further chance to refund that charge when targeting a weaker mob, and 4 ranks of dash, which reduces its CD by about 1 second, which definitely isn't a priority stat, but it's certainly better than the passive stats on the Penitent Greaves outside of its unique effect with chilling enemies. For our legs and chest, we want to utilize as much defensive stats here as possible, so on my legs, firstly, if you wanted to use Temerity, the unique pants, they're extremely good whilst leveling, especially when synergized with barrier modifiers and life gain modifiers, but what I found pushing very high sigils, I get far more value out of direct damage reduction and armor. So I found a very good leg piece, which I've placed the armor aspect giving up to 40% increase, which we're sitting at most of the time due to the consistent damage output, with very good rolls for the most part in damage reduction while injured, damage reduction from distant enemies, damage reduction from close enemies, and the only thing I'd really change is the 42% damage increase after killing an elite. Here I'd much rather have a flat damage reduction or damage reduction from poisoned enemies, or a very high roll on maximum life, which would be giving me over 1.2k additional life. Similarly with our chest, we've taken the barrier when engaging an elite enemy with as many incoming damage reduction stats as possible. I got lucky with the flat damage reduction and re-rolling for the high armor roll. Armor is absolutely busted in the current game state, and you want to be stacking as much of it as possible. Right now, never prioritize resistances over armor until they rebalance it. You're getting an insane amount of general reduction from armor, so it's one of your most important stats to seek on certain items, as well as your Paragon board, which we'll get into shortly. For the helm, as a unique option, you have the Cowl of the Nameless, which increases lucky hit chance, which is very good, as well as the native CD reduction, which is one of your priority stats on helm, so feel free to use this item if you have it, though personally I opted for an additional aspect slot in marksman abilities, giving a chance to grant Dark Shroud, which procs very often, and Dark Shroud is massive for damage mitigation, as well as getting a medium armor roll, as well as life increase. This item can definitely be improved in terms of the secondary rolls, but as you can see I have a max roll on cooldown reduction, which is probably the most important stat on both the headpiece and your amulet. Speaking of which, on my amulet I am running with Edge Masters, which grants increased damage based on primary resource, and with this build, rapid fire is returning so much energy back that we're near max resource the entire time. And for the stats, I have movement speed, cooldown reduction, damage with ranged weapons, and the energy cost reduction isn't necessary on this build, but I'll be keeping this amulet for a pen shot build, and typically your priority stats on an amulet is going to be cooldown reduction and then either further damage reduction stats, or what you can get is something like +3 ranks to the exploit passive, which I have on my Twisting Blades amulet. For ring 1, I'm using the aspect that reduces the cooldown on subterfuge skills when we're using agility skills, so basically reducing the CD on our poison trap when we use shadow step or dash, which creates that domino effect of CD reduction for death trap, which resets the CD on our shadow imbue via preparation, as well as the added small benefit of poison trap increasing the damage of our shadow step with this legendary power, as that will give us the chance to refund the charge of shadow step if we kill with it. Best in slot stats for rings will always be vulnerable damage, crit damage and crit chance, but you take what you can get. As a fourth stat, resource generation is great, but on this specific build it's not that useful outside of maybe synergizing slightly with edge masters, damage based on resource, but you can also get something like a max roll to life increase. For the second ring you have a bit of a choice. I'm running with marksman abilities to have a chance to summon Arrow Storm. Now this does little to no noticeable damage, but the reason that I do use it is because it helps a lot with proccing the damage done to enemies affected by your poison trap, which reduces that cooldown on death trap, as you'll often find yourself surrounded by enemies standing in activated poison traps, and Rain of Arrows is hitting all of them, contributing to that CDR. If you wanted to go for more raw damage, then I'd recommend the aspect where critical strikes with core skills increases your attack speed by 25% on a max roll. For my one-handed swords, and you definitely want swords at endgame over daggers for that native critical strike damage, I'm running with dealing direct damage to enemies affected by your trap skills has a chance to make them vulnerable, and on the other sword we have making an enemy vulnerable has a chance to increase your critical strike chance. Now my weapons are pretty bad stat wise, but the item power is what really pushed them ahead, but generally you want to prioritize vulnerable damage and critical damage, core skill damage, and if it's a max roll or close, then dex is also a good option. But if you have to settle with damage to close enemies, that's fine as a placeholder. As mentioned, this build mostly sits in melee range with shadow stepping on top of enemies for trap placement, and distance is really only utilized to pick off targets for cleanup. For gems in our armor we want topaz for damage reduction whilst control impaired, because even though you have shadow step to get out of problems, if for whatever reason that isn't an option, CC will be what kills you. In our jewelry we want skulls for armor increase. Resistance priority is a big no-no right now until they address it, so stack as much armor as you can. In our weapons we want emeralds for critical damage to vulnerable enemies. For the Paragon board, on the starter board we're heading down the right side, ignoring the doo-doo resistances on the left, heading into prime and making our way to the glyph socket where we place the combat glyph for critical strike damage. Now I'm trying to treat this process as a ready level 100 setup, but for those who aren't level 100, if you don't have 3 boards currently unlocked, put the exploit glyph in here first. You need exploit to proc vulnerable on everything you hit. Once you unlock your 3rd board, then come back and switch in combat and place exploit into that 3rd board, which we will get to shortly. For the other 2 main nodes, pick which side you want to go down in terms of damage or damage reduction and come back to the other one later. But when getting the skillful node, definitely grab these 2 magic nodes, which will eventually be boosted with further crit damage. We're then going to head to the deadly ambush board. If any of your board looks different, then you'll just have to rotate it to look like mine. I started going down the left side, grabbing the trapper node, grabbing 5% damage to all enemies affected by traps, but ignoring trap damage, as traps damage in general isn't much use, it's more so all of the modifiers we're proccing from trapped enemies. I then grabbed the deadly ambush legendary node for critical damage to enemies affected by traps. I came back for the slayer node later and went straight to the engineering node for damage to enemies affected by traps. I grabbed the glyph socket on the way to cunning, damage reduction from enemies affected by traps, and in the glyph socket I'm running diminish, which is going to amplify the effect of those surrounding nodes, so further damage to trapped, further reduction from trapped, as well as 10% physical damage reduction from vulnerable. We then move into the exploit board. This top section I came back to once the rest of this board was finished. It's basically damage to elites, which is great, but we need to prioritize getting to the glyph socket first, so we came down and grabbed that, which is where I put the exploit glyph. I then moved left and grabbed artifice for vulnerable damage, which, as we've established, alongside critical damage is something we need to prioritize anywhere we can. So we've also taken all surrounding magic nodes. We then want a path to the legendary node, exploit weakness, so we've started making our way around, grabbing the rare node, exploit, as well as the 3 magic nodes relating to vulnerable damage. Once we've grabbed the legendary node, we head back and grab the rare node that gives damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. From here you can choose to go back and grab Hunter Killer or move on to the next board. The next board is the Tricks of the Trade trade board, though we don't actually need the legendary node, what we do want is the Havoc node for more critical damage. So we come down here and grab that and any relevant surrounding magic nodes. We then make our way up to the glyph socket, spending 1 or 2 Paragon points extra to avoid willpower nodes, as this is our most useless stat. And in the glyph socket we're running with Ranger, which increases our marksman damage, i.e. rapid fire damage. I then went up and grabbed Focus for damage to elites, dex and marksman skill damage, then headed towards the Brawler node for damage to close enemies and damage reduction from close enemies, prioritizing the magic nodes only for the damage to close enemies, and starting moving towards the 5th and final board, which we take again not for the legendary node, but I want to grab Ruin for the secondary critical strike damage, as well as the 2 critical strike magic nodes. We then want to make our way to the glyph socket, grabbing the knowledge node for flat damage and slotting in the ambush glyph for more damage to enemies affected by traps. And maybe you're starting to see why it's so important to have so much CDR on poison trap, let alone death trap. Finally, I've grabbed the training node, which isn't so important, but it has 2 surrounding rare nodes that boost damage to trap affected enemies. So finally, a quick rundown of your rotation. In ranged situations, you're going to clear with your Shadow Imbue, dropping poison trap if anything gets close, but for big packs and elites, you're going to shadow step in, imbue, death trap, poison trap, imbue, and have your shadow step ready to disengage if things get hairy or you get CC'd. If it's a tanky pack, after that initial rotation you could spam shadow step to reduce the CD on poison trap, which will then reduce the CD on death trap and repeat the cycle. Generally on big packs you should be able to cycle all of these abilities cleanly with 0 downtime. If for whatever reason you do get into trouble, simply shadow step to a distant target and rapid fire from range until shadow imbue or death trap comes back, which should take only a few seconds with all of your CDR. And that's pretty much the build, guys. If you have any questions or I've left anything out, or even if you have any recommendations on what you think might improve this build, feel free to write it down in the comments. You're also welcome to join our Discord if you're looking to make friends in Diablo or group up with people or trade. Links will be provided in the description and pinned comment. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up, as that really helps me out, and if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing for more Diablo content coming soon. Okay guys, until next time, take care.